All right, so we are going to put together a pie crust really quickly, and I'm going to share with you a couple of my tips and tricks. So the first step is going to be to add 2.5 cups of flour. So there's 1 cup, 2 cups, 2.5 cups. Okay, and to that I'm going to be adding about a tablespoon of sugar and about a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, unless you're using salted butter. And just like to kind of mix that all around. You want to make sure that you're doing this all in a really big bowl so that if you've got plenty of space to move things around. I'm going to put that to the side for a second, and I'm going to take out 1 cup of butter. So this butter right here is a cashew butter, just because our family has dairy allergies. And what you're going to want to do is just cut it up. Make sure it's like really nice and cold. And I just kind of like break it up into some kind of cubish shapes. This particular butter tends to break up kind of funny. So, okay, and I'm just using a dull butter knife to do this. So I've got my chunks here, and I'm just gonna kind of toss them into this. Try not to handle the butter too much with your hands because that will make it melt. And what we are trying to do with this is we are trying to make sure that we've got chunks of butter in our flour mixture. But these chunks right now are too big. So you can either use a fork, and this can take a little bit of time, and you just basically squish the chunks. And in doing this, you are just breaking up the butter into some smaller pieces so that when you put it in the oven and it melts, the flour will leave behind flaky pockets. Okay, so you can do that. I'm going to switch over to this. This is called a pastry blender. It's kind of like a fork, except for it's a lot bigger. So it can makes the pastry, the pie crust, come together a little bit faster. So just mix this all up. If you're doing this with a fork, it's probably going to take longer for you than what it's doing for me. But you can see that like the texture of it is starting to change a little bit. And you want to keep on mixing this until it's almost kind of like kinetic sand. You might have a couple bigger chunks in it. Kinetic sand or cornmeal, I've heard it described as. It's kind of like the texture that you want. You can see that instead of being a fine powder, it's kind of almost more sandy-like. And it's okay that we have some bigger chunks in here, but that looks about good. And then to that, what you're gonna do is you're gonna start adding some really cold water. So I have here, I'm gonna just scrape out some of this. This water is actually so cold that it's slushy. And the reason why we want it to be really cold is because we want the fat to stay as big chunks. And it's a 1/2 cup of water, but I'm not going to put all of it in yet. I'm going to do about 1/4 cup to begin with, and then mix it all in really good. You don't want to overwork it because that'll produce gluten and will make it kind of bounce back. But you also, if you don't mix it in real good during this phase, you might end up putting too much water in it, and that also will produce the gluten. So added about another 1/2 of it. And the pie crust I made earlier today required about 3/8 cup of water, which is about what I have in here right now. But I'm wondering if, because it's so cold, if it's gonna come together a little slower. that's okay. There's no need to rush this process. Okay. You can see it's starting to stick together. I don't want to do that too much with my hands because I don't want to melt it, because right now it is really nice and cold. So I'm going to add a little bit more of this. And honestly, I think that might be good. And I am just gonna check it a little bit with my hands. Just see if we can get it to come together. Squish it in. Just a little. So this last part can be a little bit tricky because it really is about how it feels. You don't want it so wet that it like sticks to your hands, which is why I have to mix all this stuff that's a little bit drier still into it. But it is really, really cold, which is really, really great, because that means that the fat is staying nice and solid. And at this point, I'm just gonna put it out on the counter, which is cleaned it so that I can work on the counter. Okay. And I take about the whole of it, and I'm just gonna split it into 2 pieces. Okay. And I'm gonna take each of these 2 pieces and make them kind of like a hamburger patty. Flatten them out a little bit. Make them sort of roundish. And in here, you can actually still see a couple parts where you still see like the butter, you can see some of the sugar and stuff. And that's okay. It doesn't need to be blended so that it looks the same throughout, because those bigger chunks of butter are actually going to create your layers. So like that one looks really good. Let's just squish this one out a little bit too. And notice it's not sticking to my hands anymore. It doesn't really stick that badly to the countertop. Of course, when we roll this out, we will flour it all really good, but that looks really nice. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cover these in some cling wrap. So I'm just gonna take 2 pieces of cling wrap, and then your pie crust, you want to let it rest so that really all the water gets absorbed, all the liquid gets absorbed into the flour. So you want to let it rest for at least an hour, but overnight is even better. And so our plan is to let it rest overnight in the refrigerator. And again, you want to be doing this in the fridge so that the pie crust, the fats in the pie crust stay nice and solid. So I'm gonna put these into the fridge, and tomorrow we'll work on the apple part.